welcome. I'm so glad that all of us could make it tonight for this continuation of yoga philosophy. And not all of you were able to be here the first time, and that's fine because I think you all got a copy of the recording if you wanted it, and you've seen the handout. And the thing about these teachings is many of us don't get them the first time around. Let me just put it that way. And so if it's your first time hearing some of this, just take it in the best you can. And if it's the 50th time hearing this, see what's new for you. I find myself, and I certainly found when I was preparing for tonight, that I always see things in new ways as I go deeper and deeper and look at them again and again. So this evening, we're going to look at the ego and karma. And we're going to look at it from the teachings, mostly of classical yoga, of the Vedanta yoga of Patanjali. We'll be looking at it a little bit from the perspective of some of the tantric teachings as well. And we're going to be looking at it from the perspective of Kali Ki and what we are as a group of healers and a group of meditators. So before we do anything else, though, I'd like to invite us to just go inward. I'm going to play the bowls a little bit and give you an opportunity to center and tune into your inner self. But it's inquiry using what each individual has available to him or her without any extra technology in order to look into what is inside of us without any extra technology. And so yoga is really the science of the self looking at the self, the being looking at the being. We consider that there are many levels of being, but there's the ultimate level of being, pure awareness. What in Western tradition we might call God, but in Eastern tradition is really about consciousness, awareness. I call it limitless love. It is unbounded and free. It is love that is not relational, not dependent on an other, but it is rather the substrate of everything. And this love that has no form, that actually has no content, no characteristics, but is diffuse, limitless, boundless, all-knowing. In yoga, finds its way into rippling out by constricting its vastness and becoming the relative world, the world that we live in as individuals and communicate in, the world in that are dependent on an other. Yoga is the process of looking inward as one of these distinct individuals and going through the layers of density back into the formlessness and finding that we are that. Tattvam asi. I am that. I am none other than the formless, limitless, boundless love that is the substrate of all being. And for those of us who practice Reiki, it is that universal life force energy. And we pulsate back and forth between our individual consciousness and awareness of the wholeness of pure being. Out of love, we are born, and back into love, we dissolve. So much in between. So please begin to follow your inhalations and your exhalations. And imagine a spot about 12 inches in front of your heart, at the perimeter of your own human energy field. And imagine as you inhale that you're inhaling in from this spot, this Bindu point. It's as if that Bindu point pours out into the great vastness, the great boundless, limitless love, the absolute. And as you breathe in, there's a formation that happens. And when that breath is taken into the heart, there's you, your individual self. And as you exhale back out into that point, that you radiates out to the Bindu and back into the vastness, reabsorbing into the whole. Breathing in from the whole, feeling yourself as the one individual being that you know in this lifetime. And then exhaling back out into the wholeness. This breath that you're breathing is the breath of the mantra Hum Sa. When you breathe in, it's the sound of at the heart there's a merger, and then you exhale out. Sa. Breathing in. The the wholeness, the great self, the absolute. I am that. Ha, sa. The breath itself is a mantra, a vibration of the truth of all yoga. Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. This is the first great sutra of the Yoga Sutras. And it means yoga is the succession of the vrittis, the fluctuations of the mind, of the consciousness. And I didn't write the page number down on here, but it should be very... 8? Thank you. Yeah, the selected Yoga Sutras for study. Yoga Sutras, which are like probably the most famous yogic books, other than the Bhagavad Gita, which, as I mentioned last time, is the most widely read scriptural book in the world. Noelle recently introduced me to this How to Know God by Christopher Isherwood, which is a beautiful, very readable book about the Yoga Sutras. And a lot of the Yoga Sutra books are highly interpreted by their authors. This one is too, but this one really, to me, rings very true. And Christopher Isherwood is a very respected yogi. He wrote it in 1953, the first copy, and it keeps getting republished. This is the one that I tend to use, and it's kind of nerdy, but wonderful. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali by Edwin F. Bryant. So if you really want to go deep in your studies, this is the book that I would recommend. But this is the first statement. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the succession of the fluctuations of the mind. The vrittis are the fluctuations of the mind. And what I'm going to be posing tonight is that our ego and all the karmas that contribute to our ego, our personality, and how we act and what we do, what we think, and who we think we are all vrittis. They're all fluctuations of the mind. And so, basically, we want them to cease, to stop. We want them to stop their fluctuating. And I don't know that there's anybody in here who hasn't from time to time wished that their mind would stop moving around and be, chasing monkeys through the jungle and the trees. And that's really what yoga is all about. It's coming into a place of stillness, which is a place of wholeness, a place of fullness. So I'm just going to start with that aphorism, that's sutra. Sutra means aphorism. Sutra is like a verse for the sacred scriptures. And it's really cool to know that some of the Sanskrit is very much related to English. So, for example, the word suture in English actually comes from sutra. So a sutra is like a little stitch. It's a couple stitches. It's a very short aphorism, and but you put all those stitches together, and you've got something pretty great. So last time we actually did look at this chart. So I don't want to review it in a lot of detail this time, and I've kind of made it complicated by adding a few things. But you have this chart in the toward the very last page, I think, of your handout. And these are the koshas, or the 5 sheaths of the human being. And they're important to understand because, as I was trying to get to in the opening meditation, what we are is consciousness cloaked. Okay? Consciousness condensed. We're the absolute, condensed, cloaked, sheathed, so that we have this appearance, right, of solidity, of form, and of separate identity. So the koshas start with consciousness, pure consciousness, and I will call that limitless love, here in the very center. The thing that is kind of confusing about this chart is, well, this is like the smallest, but actually, of course, it's huge, right? You know, this is limitless consciousness, so it has no boundary, no container. It's not bound by time, by space. It's pure, infinite knowledge, wisdom, etc. So there we are. That is what some call God, what some call absolute consciousness, what some call pure awareness. Another name for it is the Param Atman. Atman is self, Param is the greatest, so the highest level of self. So in Hinduism, you often see self with a capital S, that's the absolute. Then you see self with a small s. That actually is our Purusha, our soul element. Then we have the ego, which is our individual, separate identity. At least that's how I'm teaching it. Everything in yoga is taught by different schools in a lot of different ways, just so you know that. The good thing about that is that if I'm teaching you something and you've heard it differently in another school, it doesn't mean that I'm wrong or they're wrong. It's just we're taking it from a slightly different angle. So starting here with what we call the causal body. Of course, there's no body. There's no physical body. But this is the sheath of Anandamaya. It's Anandamaya kosha. It's pure bliss. It's absolute consciousness. It's limitless love. Then it gets more or less solidified. And we move from what's called the causal body, that which causes everything, right, outward to what's called the subtle body. And the subtle body is the next 3 rings. Wait, let me make sure I'm doing my own thing right. Okay, 1 and 2 are actually the causal body. The causal, the source, the bliss that surrounds that is really, you could consider that second one as the Purusha, or the soul's essence. So there's the great cosmic body, then there's the soul. So 1 and 2, and then 3, 4, and 5 are these. They're progressively getting from subtle to gross in terms of what they are. So we go from bliss, the illumined sheath, into discernment, the intellectual sheath. I call this the wisdom body. The Sanskrit term for it is Vijnana Maya Kosha, and Vijnana means knowledge or wisdom. Then we've got the mental sheath, or mind. Now, within the mental sheath actually is where the ego is contained, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Because in yoga, you've got layers and layers and layers and layers within layers within layers. So I'm telling you that there's this layer called the mental sheath, which fits within the subtle body, okay? And then within the mental sheath, you've got 3 other sheaths, and the one is, let's just call it intellect. But it's more than that, it's our knowing. And then the next one is our egoic self, our sense of identity and self-discrimination, differentiation, individuation. And then beneath that is manas, which is actually the mind functions, the functions of the mind that are required in order to have a concept of an individual self and are required in order to have intellectual reasoning and understanding. All of that, no, I'm gonna skip on. Okay, so that's the mental layer, and that's where ego is. Now, ego being housed there, okay, so all these more subtle elements are behind it, so to speak. Let's look at it that way. Center, it's coming out. So I'm here. I'm in ego. Behind me is some of my thought processes. Behind that further is pure wisdom. Behind that is my soul. And behind that is the causal body or the universal. So I'm nested within all of those things. I don't see them, right? Because I'm just sitting here. I'm looking out at you. I'm looking out at the world of senses and objects and relations. Because I, the ego, am living in the relative world. So what happens with me, the ego, is I think I'm the only dude. I think I'm the only one around. I don't even recognize that I'm resting within all this universal cosmic support. So I have to protect myself. I have to defend myself. I have to be always on the guard for threat. I'm always looking out there. I'm always being vigilant. I always want to make sure that I've got one up on my fellow partners, even if I love them to death. It's like that. Speaking of death, I'm terribly afraid of it because I have no sense really of there being anything else but right here, right now, me, and in front of me, you see, I have my vital body, my energy body, which I really don't understand anyway, but my vital body, my energy body, is the system of chakras and nadis that support both my egoic mental structures and support my body. So my job as ego is to take care of my body and to make sure there's plenty of space for this body and that this body's comfortable, this body's well taken care of. And so I have to negotiate with all these other perceived bodies out there. What I don't recognize again is that just as I'm resting in wisdom, soul, and universal, well, Marcy's resting in the same thing. And Doug's resting in the same thing. And so is Noelle. And actually, that is so much greater than any of our little ego selves, that all our efforts and our tendencies to try to protect, defend, and make sure that, I'm inching just a little bit ahead of you. What's the point? What we have behind us is so vast. And what's got our back, so to speak, is so vast, but we don't see that, so we have all our little arguments and we're staring each other down, and we're loving each other and we're caring, and we want to make sure that our species moves on, and we want to make sure that we leave our legacy, and so we have our relationships and we have our families, and we do our good works, and we do all that stuff. So this is what I really wanted to explain about how these circles work. And I don't want to go into too much detail about the outer circles because we actually did this some last time. But the physical body, that is actually called the Annamaya Kosha, and Anna means food. So the physical body is our food sheath in multiple ways. One, meaning that it requires food to sustain it. So this is the only one of our these layers of bodies that requires something external to sustain it. We have to take food from out there in the world of senses, and we have to bring it in. And we feed ourselves. Now, the rest of the bodies are really sustained by pure subtle energies. Okay, so we've got that. We are food and we need food is one way of looking at it. You know, in some societies and certainly in some cultures, the physical body is buried and is restored to earth. And we have other rituals around which our bodies are restored or reabsorbed by earth, which is another, some consider earth to be in the same layer as number 6, I'm sorry, but some have it as another layer, that there's that dense layer of the earth and all the actually all the planets, the galaxies, I was going to say concrete, they're not, but all the really dense energies, right, which in yogic understanding are just as alive as we are, just as alive as our soul is, just as alive as the universal consciousness is, because everything comes from that universal consciousness. It's just the same energy getting a little bit more, a little less subtle, a little more gross. And is that actually what's happening with all that energy? Or is it just how we're perceiving it? That's a really big question in yoga. We'll touch on it a little bit tonight. We're not going to answer it, but I'm just putting it out there for you guys to just kind of play with when you need some mental gymnastics. In the Shiva Sutras, which is a tantric understanding, is this amazing sutra, Shiva Sutra 3-4. I can't read it from there. Where is it? Okay. Sharire samhara kalanam. Sharire is the subtle body, and basically what it's saying is you must make all the circles in your body, right? Because we are the body of the Absolute. The Absolute has no body but us. One of my favorite Christian sayings is Saint Teresa of Avila basically saying, Lord, you know, there are no other hands on earth now but mine. And yours are these, you know, I am doing this with your hands. I'm doing this as your hands. So, Sharire Samhara Kalanam, you must make all the circles in your body enter one into the other from gross to subtle. So in this little meditative journey, I had you move from subtle to gross. And in yoga, in order for the vrittis to cease, the fluctuations, we move back from gross to subtle. And then there's that pulsation, from subtle to gross, from gross to subtle. And we do this with the breath, we do this with our practices, and we actually do this with also, we employ our physical body. We want our physical body to be in perfect alignment with all the other bodies. This is why in yoga there's the practice of asana. There are many other, of course, physical practices that we can do, which include how we move our body. They include the foods we eat. They include the environments we put ourselves in. They include our overall physical health, our energy body, our chakras, making sure that our energies, our vitalities are energized and balanced. This is what we do in Reiki healing. We're always working to balance the energies of the body. We do this in all other kinds of energy healings as well. And so we're trying to bring harmony into the energy that actually is supporting the organs and the muscles of the physical body, and is actually that which quickens the physical body. So we want that to have alignment. We want that then to be in alignment with our our egoic self-identity, with our brain functioning, and with our intellect, and ultimately our wisdom. The wisdom body lies between our mental body and the bliss body, the pure consciousness of our soul. Our wisdom body is where we have our psychic intuitions, where we have prescient dreams, and is so important. And our wisdom body begins to open up for us as we meditate, as we do Reiki, as we do spiritual practices. And so many of you, that I've worked with over the years are having phenomenal transcendental experiences. And it's because that wisdom body layer is opening up and you're having access to it. And we begin to be able to move more freely back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Okay, so I'm going to do a little... Any questions or any comments? Okay, moving on. I'm going to do a little bit of just a review. So the ego in yogic psychology, which is a little different from Western psychology and yet has many parallels, it serves to do a few things. It serves to differentiate and individuate. Because we are living in this relative world, right? I do need to watch out for where I'm, how I'm walking through time and space. I don't want to be bumping into people. I don't want to be bumping into things. I need to know up from down. I need to keep this body fed. I need to do these things, and I need to have a certain understanding of who this being is as an entity, apart from the entity that is Mike, let's say. And then we have, of course, all our psychological development that we need to do over a lifetime when we come into the world as babies who are pure consciousness, right? And you can watch in babies how that process starts to happen, almost immediately. The ego serves to regulate our emotions. It also regulates our reasoning. It helps with our reasoning ability. It's there to help to protect, to defend us. And it is the decider and the manager of so much of what we do and who we are. It goes overboard is one of the things, one of the problems with it. But the ego, in its purest, is an instrument of Prakriti. Prakriti is that feminine force of divine manifestation, of matter, and the Purusha. The Purusha is the masculine absolute force. So these are other words for what we were just talking about. Prakriti creates these denser and denser circles of being, okay, that are layers of ourself. And so ego's one of her instruments, one of her many instruments. And principally what it does is it does bring individuation from the great formlessness so that we can act as an independent conscious entity within the relative world. So there is an understanding in yoga that there's the absolute and there's the relative, and that they are different from one another even though the relative consists of only the absolute. Okay, if that makes sense. So then, as I said, the ego kind of, goes a little far, and it sees itself because it's looking outward. It doesn't recognize all this support behind it. It doesn't even know to turn around and look and see what might be there. And it only looks with these external eyes. We have to get trained. We have to have a withdrawal of our physical senses, which is called pratyahara, to engage our inner senses so that we can, so to speak, turn around and see what's behind us. But in the meantime, the ego, it sees itself like it's the producer, director, it's all the actors, it's the grips, it's even the stage itself, right, in which the all-important and story of one, moi, right, is produced. And this is how the ego pretty much operates. Now, okay, I might bring some other characters into my play because they're convenient for whatever the theme of my play is in this moment. And I'll even, grant that they too have life and that they may be even able to make some of their own choices and their decisions. But I'm perfectly capable of kicking them off the stage if they're not suiting my needs in the moment, because the ego is also very capable of inflation and deflation. And so these are the things that we know very well from our own experiences in life, and we know from Western psychology. So again, the ego sees itself as being alone, as being separate. It doesn't understand itself as part of a whole energetic ecology that consists of other aspects of itself. So it inflates, it deflates, it looks outward at the world of senses and objects. So how does this happen? Well, the ego is bound by what we call the kleshas. And these are poisons that cloud the mind and cause suffering. So you can go to pages 9 and 10. Sutra, starting with Sutra 2.2. Samadhi bhavanartha klesha tanu karanatascha. The yoga of action is, and by the way, we're going to get to that because action means karma, karmic yoga, is for bringing about samadhi, the ultimate consciousness, and for weakening the afflictions, kleshas, to yoga. So these kleshas are impediments. The next one, I'll just read the English. The impediments to samadhi are nescience, which basically means ignorance, ego, desire, aversion, and clinging to life. So I want to explain these a little bit. Nescience, ignorance, also known as avidya, is incomplete knowledge. So the ego's really good at judging, and it's actually really good at judging itself, right? We do a lot of self-judgment, and that's part of our deflation process most of the time. Sometimes our self-judgment is part of our inflation process too, right? But the ego does tend to judge. So I'm going to ask you to try to put your own judgment in abeyance as you're listening to this and just thinking about this for yourself. Because the understanding here is that the ego has only access to incomplete knowledge. And indeed, that's the truth, that all this that it's resting in is without other interventions, typically not seen, not considered available. So the ego operates with the best that it has, which is basically the world of sense perception, of relativity, the relative world. And the ego doesn't know how to bring in what it might learn from the absolute, from the psychic realms and from other realms of consciousness. So it's, it's kind of operating with a handicap. It doesn't know that, but it is. Then the second one, asmita, it actually means ego. So the ego is hampered by asmita. The ego is hampered by ego. So this is where terminology gets complicated. I've been saying ego. The actual Sanskrit word is ahankara, which we translate as ego. It actually means something a little bit different, and it has to do with the vehicle of our identity. But asmita is our erroneous attachment to the personal mind. So that's what our ego is. It's attached to its own thought processes, its own doings, its own activities. Of course it is. It's trying to take care of itself. And it's trying to figure out, how do I live in this world with all these other beings and all these things? And, how do I have enough food and clothing and shelter and all of that? I mean, it's doing its work, but it's attached to that. And again, is not seeing the great mind, the great self that supports it and is behind it. And then the third, what's the English translation? Well, raga means desire or attachment to limited objects, states, and identities. And of course, we know we have so many ego attachments, our identities, I know myself as a mom, as a woman, as a teacher, as an accountant, as a lawyer, as a member of this organization or that organization, or a supporter of this. I know myself as a student of this. All these identities are like what forms us and what gives us our sense of our individual being. And we become attached to those in that, it's like, I don't know what I would do if I weren't a wife, or I don't know what I would do if I didn't have my career. We kind of like, because that's me. And that's our identity. And again, it's that looking outward, it's that relative sense, that relative world sense of me. And then, of course, there's the attachment to all the comforts in our world, and all the things that we love and that we enjoy, the entertainments, because we love to laugh and we like to feel good, and all of that. It's lovely and it's wonderful. It's interesting because that has its opposite, that also forms the ego and is one of the kleshas, the impediments to true yoga. Dvesha, which, unlike desire, it's aversion. But you see, I also identify who I am by those things that I avoid, or that I see as repulsive, repugnant, or not me, me, not me. Think of your political party, think of your favorite team. I'm a fan of them and I'm not a fan of them. Your favorite TV show, whatever it is. And so this is also a huge part of our identities. So we're just as attached to what we don't like and don't want as we are to what we do like and we do want. And then finally, abhinivesha, that clinging to life, the fear of death. Really interesting one. Wait a minute. So this is a poison or a toxin to want to avoid death? Well, at a certain level, yes, it is, to have this fear of death that rules us, right? Because that's what the ego's doing. The ego is going about daily life, making sure that it exists, that it survives, when what's supporting it is infinite. But it's not seeing that, so it's all about its own individual survival. Okay, so these are, I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but we talk a lot in yoga about ignorance. And ignorance in general Western culture, it's like it's not a nice word, it's a rude word. But we want to understand that in yoga, our ignorance is simply the not knowing, the not recognizing, the not seeing, the not understanding, the whole of which we are a part. Okay? So then ego is actually, it's an illusion of separateness, or being outside of the ultimate, or not even knowing that there is an ultimate that we're outside of. And again, that belief that this is the world, the relative world, that I have to negotiate with, and I have no choice but to negotiate the best I can for my survival. And I'll do that by having my likes and my dislikes, my preferences and my non-preferences, and I'll do that by having my identities and forming, that reputation that I have, and, having a role and a status in the world that I live in. However, what we don't recognize is that the ego is actually, it's a receptacle for all of this. That it is a spark of the divine, and that's what's not being recognized in most of the time. So it is the third level of self, like I said before. So there's the absolute self, and then there's the soul, the individual self. And one way of looking at the soul is that's used a lot is to think about the absolute as the sun, and then we like to think about the array of a sun, so that the soul self is like a ray of the sun that shines outward. But what we know about a sun ray is it is fully and completely dependent on the sun. You wouldn't have a ray if you didn't have the sun. And for that matter, the idea of a sun ray is actually an illusory idea, because we can't see an individual ray of the sun. There actually are no individual rays of the sun. Now we can do things looking through trees and things like that. We can manipulate our hands so that we get the illusion of a ray. But there is no ray. And that's that whole notion of moving back and forth. And then even further out from that is the ego, which wraps itself around that ray and forms this sense of a solid identity. So it's actually illusory in yoga, and it's part of Maya, a word I'm sure that you've all heard. So again, to understand that the ego is embedded in the soul self, which is embedded in the absolute. Our inability to understand that is our ignorance of Maya. So when the ego somehow, some way, gets triggered to begin to relax enough to maybe notice, oh, I am being held. Oh, I don't have to work so hard. Oh, then the ego gets inquisitive. Well, what is this? What is supporting me? I've had this illusion all along that it's my physical body, my physical brain that I'm commanding. I'm talking about ego self here, right? That has been the doer in this world all along. But now I'm getting a sense of, wait a minute, am I the doer? What is actually supporting me? What is enlivening me? And then the ego begins to start to tune in at least to the next level back, to its inner psychic wisdom. And this is when we begin to move a little bit further toward the spiritual path and toward that backward motion of being reabsorbed in the whole. This is when our levels of consciousness, which are listed here and we talked about last time, so I'm not going to go through these, but they do begin to change. Whereas the ego typically is only aware of our waking state of consciousness, our dreaming, when we're asleep and we have regular dreams, and that it sleeps, even though, as you know, we never have identity when we're in deep sleep. The ego begins to find its way into the fourth, or the transcendental state, the turiya state, and begins to have that sense of, oh, it's not all me. It's not all about me. And again, it gets inquisitive. So what is it all about? And what else is there? And we do start to actually visibly relax, because it's not all up to us, and we're not the doer, and we're not the decider. We contribute to that, and in the relative world we still make decisions and we still act and various things, but we begin to recognize this whole ecology of all these beings who are also being held and supported and nested within the infinite, within the grander scheme of things. So this is what begins to happen when we get on our spiritual journey, and our level of consciousness begins to change. So I'm gonna actually think I'll tell you a story, and then we'll take a little break because I don't want to talk about karma until after the break and how the karma interacts with the ego. So you all have a sense of what I mean when I say Maya. Maya is the illusion of this life, that the understanding is that the relative world at a certain level is illusory. And it is because it's all about the absolute, right? Becoming grosser and grosser and grosser. And we want to get back to that absolute. But Maya is considered to play and dance and move, and she's the mover and shaker of the world. So I just want to tell you this story because it's so lovely. And I heard this when I was actually on retreat in Hawaii with Gangaji's husband, Eli, told this story. It's just so lovely. So I want to share it with you as best I can. So a student, a seeker, was sitting with his great master under a tree in India, and he said, "Oh, great master, please, can you tell me what Maya is?" The master said, "First, go to the village and get me a drink and bring it back, and then I'll tell you what Maya is." So the good student marches off to the village and goes to the local well, and there he finds a glass. But not only does he find some water to put in the jar, but there's a beautiful young woman there at the well. And they begin to talk to each other, and they just have such an attraction, such a connection, and it is so beautiful. And they're both amazed because this is not what happens in India. You never go to a well unaccompanied, especially a young woman, and seldom would a man and a woman meet each other at a well like this and have hours in which to talk and share. But indeed they do, and they've already fallen in love. And she said, "I want to take you to meet my father." And he says, "Okay." And so they go, and he meets the father, and the father's a very wealthy merchant and a farmer, and he has much land. And he's so excited to meet this new young man that he brings him in and teaches him how to farm and how to manage the lands. And of course they get married, and they're just so phenomenally happy. Everybody from miles around come to the wedding, to the village, and everybody's celebrating this wonderful marriage. And they're so phenomenally happy and successful, and they've got all these riches, and everything is just going so well. And then, of course, they have a beautiful baby boy, and the baby boy is just so good looking and so strong and so intelligent, and he's clearly going to grow up to be very wealthy and to take over the lands and the homes. And then they have a gorgeous baby girl, and she too is, beautiful beyond beautiful, because all Indian stories are very sexist. And she's going to be, just absolutely loved and adored, and she's treated like a goddess, and they're just so phenomenally happy. Everything is going so well. And then one day they're out in the fields, and suddenly they look up, and the clouds come, and a violent storm arises, and it comes out of the sea that's close to them, and the tsunami comes, and it strikes them, and he's holding on to one of the children. His wife is holding on to the other children, and he's trying to hold on to her, and he can't, and he lets go, and she goes swimming off with the child, and then later he sees them floating, and they're gone, and he still has this baby. He tips down to reach out to his wife, and that baby goes into the river, and they're all gone into the tsunami. And when he comes out of it, he's crying and crying and crying and crying, so many tears. And he looks down, and all those tears are filling his jug. And he is back by the tree with the master. Master, here is your water. And Master said, and there is your Maya. So this is the journey of the ego. Okay. I had a guided meditation, but let's go ahead and take a little break because.
Okay, so now I'm going. Maybe I should have saved this question for later. But it just came up to me. It was like I was trying to really grasp the idea of it. I think because I've had this question like, what is the personal soul? I'm calling it personal soul, but that's like the idea of personal soul. And when you were talking, which you were just the way you were explaining everything, and the ego and this, what's behind the ego, was just beautiful and just so easy for me to grasp. But then I thought, like, is the individual soul through reincarnation like that ray of the divine that cycles energetic, like it's the same energetic? I'm like trying to...
I am so glad you're asking that because that's the perfect segue into what we're going to talk about next.
So it's like, what is this concept of individual soul, and that is having a separate or unique experience kind of concept? Okay, perfect question. Nobody else gets to ask a question right now because I want to go start talking about that. Okay, but you ask questions as we go. Okay, so this is where we start to talk about karma, right? Karma, the word, simply means action or activity. It also means work or workings. So our karma are our actions, our activities, our workings. It's the workings of the ego. Okay? Karma and our karmic patterns, the patterns of our activity and our workings, so to speak. I'm mostly talking about mental, emotional workings, not our physical workings, but karma influences the physical totally because physical is only energy, right? This is what shapes our ego and our personality. It's our karmas. It's our activities. Now, karma, our karmas are vrittis, they're fluctuations. It's movement, it's activity, right? It's always happening. And we understand with karma that every time there's an action, there is a reaction or a response. We have a response within ourselves to our own thoughts. We have a response within ourselves to our own actions. And then when we think, it affects those thought fields around us, other people. When we act, it affects those others around us. It affects our environment. What we think about, that's where our attention goes, and that's actually what we create in so many ways. But not only does every action create a reaction, but every reaction creates a re-reaction, and every re-reaction creates a re-re-reaction ad infinitum. So each one of us is a phenomenal storehouse of so many karmas that it's beyond our ability to tear them all out, because there's nothing that we can do, think, say, be, feel, experience that doesn't create a multiple chain. No one being is not part of a whole huge multiple chain of beings. So all my karmas are influencing, not all, but 18 billion of my karmas are influencing 18 billion of your karmas, and we still have infinite billion left to go. And they're affecting Mike's, and they're affecting Marcy's, and on and on and on and on. It's incomprehensible. This is the web or the net of Indra. It really is incomprehensible to the thinking mind. So each of us is a storehouse of infinite karmas. What are these karmas? They're memories, perceptions, judgments, likes, dislikes, identities, dreams, fantasies, imaginations, on and on and on. Whew. Okay. So there are 4 general types of karmas that I want to talk about. And this is where we get into an understanding of what reincarnation is and the soul. Okay? So in yoga, mostly they talk about 3. I say there's 4 because I add in something that I call ancestral karma. So the first karma is past life karma. This is what we hear a lot about. So this explains reincarnation in that, along with our pure soul, because the Purusha self, the soul self, is pure, absolute pure. But along with it, let me say, the Purusha self is within. The body self, the ego self, let's just say, surrounds it, right, is the packaging that it's traveling in the relative world with. That's its function, is to work in the relative world. So this being, this karmic being, Kalisara, has so many karmas built up that even though the body dissipates, dies, dissolves, is reabsorbed, okay, the soul, which is infinite anyway, the ray of the sun is infinite because the sun is infinite. And now we're talking about a cosmic sun, a God sun. You know, we know our physical sun is not infinite, but the sun that is Brahma, that is the absolute, is infinite, imperishable, just as are its rays. Okay, so the soul is imperishable. It lets go of this body, but there's still a lot of karmic impressions left, right? So when another body is found for this soul to be wrapped in for a certain period of time, it doesn't bring with it all its memories about individual identity, but it brings in all these karmic impressions, inclinations, characteristics, the personality, right? This is how karma comes forward into the next life and the next life and the next life. Now, I would say we're not just talking about next human incarnation and next human incarnation. And this is, yoga doesn't believe it's always human incarnation. We may go into an animal incarnation. We may go into an incarnation in another realm. It may be an incarnation or an existence that is actually in a body that is much less gross than this one. We might go into the God realms, we might go into the demon realms, we might go into the multiple realms, the Siddha realms, etc., etc., etc. So that's kind of it. I hope that helps to explain. But the individual soul is this pure essence, this pure ray of the universe, and then it just gets surrounded in all of these. So yoga is the succession of all of that. So we do want eventually, 18 million lifetimes from now, or this lifetime, is really what we want. We want this all to cease so that we can then just be the sun again. We can be the ray and we can be the sun. So that's the goal of yoga. The ego that's only looking outward has no sense that there could be any goal like that at all. But once the ego begins to get relaxed into and eases its own tight grip on, I know what reality is and I am it, then the ego can begin to look at this. And this is when we want to start looking at our karmas. How do we cease this constant fluctuation? That's past life karma. Then what I call ancestral karma. Now, this is what I would say that our tribal or even the species collective unconscious, what Jung talks about as the collective unconscious. These are the movements, the vrittis of all of humanity and or of our own tribe, our own ancestral tribe, our relatives going backwards. What we find, especially in Reiki, is we're often doing ancestral clearing work
that we're working with me in this generation, and by clearing me in this generation, we find that there's a clearing that goes way back in multi-generations. And well, now we know this only through the psychic. We can't know this through the physical, but we do know this in the psychic, and of course it brings the healing forward to us. So I think this is a really important one that allows for healing, for global healing, for tribal healing, for ancestral healing. Then there's our current life history, right? All the traumas that we experienced as children, our family dynamics, our relationship issues, our work issues, where we're born, our level of wealth or poverty, all of these things, that we've been dealing with since we were kids come forward into the now and into our yoga practices and into our attempted understanding about who we are. And they're a huge part of our identity, okay? What our past karmas were, this life, past karmas were. And then we've got our everyday living karmas. So even if we were able to clear all the karmas from our early life, our ancestors, and multiple lifetimes, as long as we're in this body, we're still doing activity. And activity creates reactivity, creates karma. So we're always creating karma. But I'll get to that in a little bit about then, well, what do we do about that? If we become fully awakened, we're still going to be creating karma. How are we ever going to attain the ultimate? And I will get to that. So just bear with me a little bit. So just to understand these a little bit better, these 4 levels, past life, ancestral, current life history, and everyday living karmas, just think about one example. So, and think about this for yourself. Are you a person who your attitude toward abundance is one of, you just, things are cool. You trust in abundance. You feel like you're going to be fine. You don't worry about, am I going to have enough money? Am I going to have enough of this, enough of that? Or are you someone who really tends to worry a lot? Am I going to be able to hold this job? Is this going to support me? What if I get sick? What are your attitudes towards abundance? Let's just take that as an example. And so in the karmic understanding, we could say that if you're somebody who has no worries about abundance, probably in past lives, right, you were doing pretty well. Yeah, might have been hurting other people in order to do well, but you were managing pretty well. And you lived a life of abundance and no worries, okay? Or it's quite possible if you're somebody who has like kind of a poverty attitude, that maybe in a past life you actually were somebody who was always very abundant, but you did really hurt other people to get there, and so there's a kind of switching that happens in this lifetime. That's possible. But for the most part, let's just stick with, okay, I come into this life with pretty much a sense of abundance. It's most of my lifetimes I've done pretty well. Either, through family inheritance or where I lived or, whatever I did to make sure I did well, maybe by marriage, whatever. Then we have ancestral, right? So I come into this world with my own karma from all my past lives, and then I come into this world with my ancestral karma. So were your ancestors, people that, worked really, really hard but could barely, have enough food to eat, to fill their bellies? Or were your ancestors those who, were always able to find a way to make money, to have a business, to, and we sometimes know that about our ancestors. We don't always. And then, of course, your current life history. What were you born into? Were you born into, a relative amount of wealth? And, most of us in the U.S. were, but it's still relative here, and not everybody is by a long shot. And so these things influence every moment, every thought, every decision, every action that we make. So this one notion of what is our attitude about abundance comes to us from multiple levels, so to speak, multiple karmic levels. And so, when you think about that, it may be that, you've had a kind of a poverty attitude for most of your life, and actually most of this current life, you really haven't been impoverished. Well, it starts to make sense why you feel this way. We know it's not rational, but it's there. And when we start talking about, and it's in our DNA, I think especially those of us in the metaphysical woo-woo world, we talk a lot about our DNA and how this is changing our DNA and not changing our DNA, and we're not really studying our DNA to see what's happening. But at a certain level, that's exactly what we're talking about here, that the DNA is an energetic imprint, right? Mm-hmm. And karma is an energetic imprint. And we can change that. It takes a lot of work, but we can change that. We have to believe it. We have to turn back and go, oh, hey, there's all this behind me, right? So that's just one way to think about it. Okay, so karma then is broken down into what we call vasanas and samskaras. And I'm sure many of you have heard these terms, and you may have heard them defined in many different ways. But our vasanas are our thought patterns, right? It's just how we tend to think and react in life in general. So we may be somebody that tends to always go into, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, they've always got the upper hand, I'm going to be cheated, right? Or it can be the opposite. I'm abundant, I'm smart, I'm brilliant, I can get by. I'm not worried, I don't compete. That kind of thing. These are our vasanas. They come to us again from all these different levels. They come from our past lives. They come from our ancestors, and they come from our early life. And we're recreating them every moment of every day, especially when we don't stop to think about them and hold them and work with them. And then we have our samskaras, which are more like behavioral imprints. And the samskaras have to do with our habitual responses to stimuli, like our desires, actually our aversions as well. But a real simple way of looking at this is I taste ice cream for the first time. Let me get more personal. I had a shave ice for the first time when I was recently in Maui, right? And it was like really good. And it was made of really healthy fruit and a lot of sugar, right? And, my mind might have said, well, don't have too many more of these, right? But I drive by the shave ice place, I get the stimulus, it's like, oh, I think I can stop again. I'm not going to be here too much longer, right? And, we do this all the time. It's conditioned response. This is what we talk about in psychology, stimulus and response. Except that these samskaras aren't just about the current life, right? It's about what comes into us from long, long ago. So it's like there are these deep grooves in our psyche. Like our neural pathways are just carved out in this way. And the samskaras then will be responsible for our addictions, our obsessions, our gotta have it, our one-pointed focus at whatever the thing is that I feel like I need to do or be next. And we can have positive vasanas and positive samskaras, but I'm just talking right now about the ones that tend to give us the most difficulty right now.
So our vasanas are kind of like, is our cup half full or half empty? And our samskaras are these grooves that lead into our addictions, our preoccupations. Both have to do with our self-identity, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, right? Again and again and again. And we tell these stories over and over and over again. Let me explain the samskaras a little bit more. This is important, and I think this is in your book, but don't worry about it. It's like, so there's an action or an experience that happens. So the experience is, I have a shave ice. Then there's a response, and that can be pain or pleasure. So I have a positive response. Pleasure, yeah, you betcha. And that leaves an imprint in my consciousness, in my psyche. No imprint is ever lost. So if I had that shave ice, 14 incarnations ago, or something similar, I don't think they had them, right? But if there was something like that a bunch of incarnations ago, and there's something kind of similar here, I may have an unreasonable craving or attachment for that thing, okay? So it's like you got that imprint, then there's a new stimulus, yet another one. That's what I'm talking about. So let's say, I don't know, I ate frozen snow with honey on it 3 incarnations ago, and it was just great. And then it was taken away from me because the attackers came and robbed our village, and I was moved away from the village, and I was never able to have that again. There's an imprint in the psyche of wanting that sweetened snow, so to speak. I'm making this up as I go, you know that. And then I come into this lifetime, and there's something like that. It's a new stimulus. I crave it beyond any reason or beyond any expectation. Does that make sense? And that's because the influence. What? Yeah.
Just a quick question. Can they all be these samskaras? I mean, can they all be related to one very profound experience of lack that kind of manifests in all these behaviors of needing to like hoard or be greedy or overshop or just fill like that void? Can it all be like healed, that pattern, that consistent pattern that manifests in many different ways? Can it be healed in the same way?
I actually think that it can all be healed all at once, sometimes. Not always. Yeah. Because they're so related to one another. It's like in psychology, it's the process of generalization. So if I can be healed of one certain addiction, it may be that that'll generalize to my other addictions. But not always.
Yeah.
And we've got bazillions of samskaras. Okay, so... Well, I'll move ahead. So some of you have heard me talking about the samskaras before. So when we have these imprints that have been there for incarnations, multi-generations, it's sort of like seeing a groove that's been drawn in stone, carved out of stone. It's like our neural pathways are that stuck. Our DNA is that stuck, and it's like this deep groove, and it's really hard to get out of it. However, if we start looking back, relaxing the ego, working on our practices, in time, that groove in stone becomes more like if you take a big stick and you make a line in dirt. And then over time, you take that stick and you make a line in sand. And over time, that stick it's like a line in water, and eventually a line in air. And this is what happens to our samskaras, our vasanas, our karmas. As we bathe our consciousness in the Absolute through our practices of meditation, of Reiki, anything that bathes us in this. Now, sometimes we have to do deep psychotherapy, there's all kinds of things that we may need to do to work with these things. But it's this change in consciousness. It's the being bathed, or actually, it's the opening up to what's there. And recognizing and being in the circles, right? Being reabsorbed one into the other. And those of you who do Reiki healing, you know that's what happens. And we begin to work in a more transcendent level of consciousness. So there's two things. We want to try to not create new karmas, or at least new bad karmas. And
that's what I was just going to say. Karma can go both ways.
Karmas can absolutely
be perceived as a negative, and it also can be perceived as a...
Yep. Yes, absolutely, Marcy. So, so that's the good news, right? That vasanas and samskaras can be released, and they can be counteracted by positive vasanas and positive samskaras. At the very end of our journey through the levels of samadhi, even our positive samskaras and vasanas, we want them to stop too. We want everything to stop. We want all those fluctuations to stop. But the positive ones can cancel out, so to speak, the negative ones. And then, of course, there are some that seem negative that really may be, we can get complicated with it. But Yoga Sutra 2:33, Vitarka Badane Pratipaksha Bhavanam. Upon being, you're going to love this, upon being harassed by negative thoughts, one should cultivate counteracting thoughts. Like thanks, like duh. And that's exactly what we want to do. So this is where the 8 limbs of yoga, which are listed on page 6, are really important. We've got the yamas and the niyamas, the things that we are healthful and growthful to do and to think, and the things that are that we want to avoid doing and thinking. And then beyond that, we've got our practices. We've got our practice of asana, of physical yoga. We've got our practice of pratyahara, the withdrawal of the external senses so that our internal senses can pick up all of this and we can dwell more in the transcendent levels. And then the concentration, meditation, and eventually samadhi. So right thought, right action, all of these things are going to help us to counteract any the negative samskaras and the negative vasanas. So meditation and Reiki help us to be aware of and then to release karmic patterns. In Kali Ki we talk about release then ease. And we know the process of release is not always so terribly pleasant because we have to recognize things and stuff comes up and gets regurgitated. But that happens and then there's a relaxation. And this is what happens in psychotherapy to a certain extent too. It's like we have to look at our issues, they come up, and then there's an easing. Because that's the level, that's more of the mental, psychological level. And Reiki, of course, works on multiple levels, and especially the energetic level. So every time we enter the transcendent, Turiya, and above states of consciousness, we call it a burning of the seeds of samskaras and vasanas. The samskaras are like seeds because I have this experience, I have this reaction, I'm planting a seed for the next experience to react in the same way. Okay? So if we burn those seeds through the fire of consciousness, right, then we may not, we can stop reacting to the new stimulus in the old way. Right? Makes sense. It sounds like a lot of good cognitive behavioral therapy as well. So when there's this burning of seeds, then there's a washing away of karmic accrual. So sometimes we know what the seeds contain. We know, oh, that's the seed of my addiction to shopping. Okay? But we don't always. When we get bathed in consciousness, in the transcendent and above levels, sometimes those seeds just get burnt, whether we know what they are or not, which is kind of beautiful because we don't have to understand every single issue. We don't have to remember what happened in previous lifetimes. We don't have to know what our ancestors went through. We don't even necessarily have to directly bring up traumas from our early childhood. Sometimes we do, but not always. Sometimes we can bypass those when we're in these higher levels of consciousness. And Paul Muller Ortega, one of my old teachers, used to talk about walking through the herds of sleeping elephants. That we have all these samskaras, and they're like elephants sleeping. And if you find your pathway through them, you can get to the goal of unity consciousness. But if you trip over an elephant on the way, he'll make a great bellow, the elephant sound of a big bellow, and then you'll get thrown back, so to speak. It's just kind of so we can sometimes, when we're in the great consciousness, see, when we're in that transcendent state, it's so spacious that there's room for all these samskaras and these vasanas, and sometimes we can actually, we're not actively looking, but there's like a pathway through right to the samadhi, the unity consciousness, which is what we're always trying to go back to, our home. It's our home. It's where we came from, right? Okay. So Yoga Sutras 150 and 151. 150. Tajya samskara nyaya samskara pratibandhi. The samskaras born out of truth-bearing wisdom obstruct other samskaras from emerging. So this is where we're basically saying the positive samskaras that we build up through our practices, through our good works, through our good thoughts, but really it's through our practices, you see. A good work and a good thought only goes so far if it's not immersed in the consciousness. So if we're doing something out of obligation, that's good. If we're doing something out of duty, that's fine. It's our dharma. We're doing good works. That's lovely. We go to church. We serve, and we do these good things. But only when we're doing these things and actively abiding in love, in the greater consciousness, that's when it will really obstruct other samskaras from emerging. So that's what we want, is we want to remain, we want to experience transcendent consciousness. What does that mean? It means to transcend above ordinary consciousness. We want to bring it into our ordinary daily lives. That's what happens with repeated practice of meditation, of Reiki, of really most any spiritual practice. Okay? Anything that elevates us, so to speak, to the transcendent stage, that we can then, that washes our ordinary consciousness. Our consciousness is shifted a little bit. I love the African proverb about healing. There is no healing without first a shift in consciousness. Consciousness shifts, we come into a greater sense of wholeness and balance. Our emotional body, our physical body, our mental body. Then the next Yoga Sutra, 1.51, Tasya pi nirode sarva nirodan nirbija samadhi. Upon the cessation of even those truth-bearing samskaras, nirbija samadhi, seedless meditation, meditative absorption ensues. That's a mouthful. Okay. So even those samskaras that are truth-bearing, that allow us to abide in that limitless love, even as we're interacting in the world, ultimately, even those must dissipate for us to be
truly home. In the meantime, we might be in Anandamaya Kosha, the bliss body, but to be truly one, unitive consciousness, to become the Purushottama, the divine human, right? Everything must cease. And that's nirvikalpa samadhi. It's the highest level of samadhi. It's very rare, but we begin to have a sense of it. And that's when we are jivan mukti, which means completely liberated while alive. Most of us are going to remain jivas that are a little mukti and a little not so mukti. Yeah, no, but that's okay. That's okay, but this is what we're working for. Yeah. Okay, so it's through these practices. That's why we need to do these wisdom practices, because that's what bathes us, that's what frees us from the binds of the karma and the binds of the ego. Okay. Any questions? Because I want to do a little guided meditation. Doug, would you mind turning that switch down, the toggle switch, just a little bit so we can have a little darker in here? Hopefully you're all still sort of awake. That's perfect. So just go ahead and take a couple of deep breaths in through the nose and sigh it out through the mouth. It's a lot of information to take in. And I'm hoping that you're not taking it in just from the mental plane, that your body is feeling it, that your heart is feeling it, that you're really getting a sense of these karmas that are part, they're our story. They're our ego story, they're our identity, they're our sense of self, and some of them have come to us from times long, long forgotten, and really may not be so irrelevant. So we want to release them. So I'm going to take you on a little guided meditation for releasing some of the karmas that you hold. So do a couple more of those deep breaths, breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. And those of you who know the Kali Ki breath, do a couple of those. You start at the third eye, you inhale down to the root chakra, exhale to the center of the earth, inhale back up through the earth, through the body, to the crown of the head, and then feel that beautiful cleansed energy washing your aura on the outside of the body. So remember I said that sometimes we know what these seeds are, these karmic seeds, these samskaras, these vasanas, and other times we don't know what they are. So I'm just going to invite you to kind of scan your body-mind, your energy body, and just notice where there seems something that is obstructing, almost like plugging up the free flowing of the energy system. And you may have a sense that, oh yeah, this is my issues with my child, my spouse, my parents. These are the things I haven't worked out yet in my job. This is my deep-seated anger or shame. You may have a sense of that. Or you may just kind of feel and see with your inner eye some blocking, some gunk. And notice where you might feel it in your body. And just let yourself have some awareness of that which is stopping, plugging, obstructing the free flow of your energies. Physical, energetic, mental, emotional. Your wisdom, blocking your intuition, or blocking all of it. And now imagine a point out in front of this blockage at about 8 to 16 inches in front of you, in front of that blockage, at the edge, the perimeter of your energy field. And then imagine outside that field, you see a great being, a beloved being. Could be the image of a deity, a guide, an enlightened being, a great master. And imagine that as you inhale, they are exhaling. They exhale their breath right into that area of your blockage. And then imagine another great being behind you, right behind that area of blockage, at about the same distance as the beautiful being in front of you. And as you inhale into that blockage from the front, you inhale from that point in front of you where that being in front of you is, as they're exhaling. Now, as you exhale, the breath exhales from behind, from the center to the being behind you. The being in front is exhaling as you inhale. The being behind is inhaling as you exhale. And you just watch this flow of breath between yourself and these two great beings. And perhaps you begin to feel that plug, that obstruction, beginning to loosen, to soften. Perhaps some of its solidity, as it moves back and forth between these breaths, begins to dissipate. Perhaps it begins to get smaller. Where it once clogged and congested, perhaps there's more space. Perhaps the being in the back reaches out a hand and helps to dislodge this karmic chunk. perhaps one of the beings has a message for you. New wisdom, new insight. Let the breath continue to create spaciousness around this karmic chunk, melting, dissolving. Is there something these beings want you to know about this obstruction? Is there an instruction for you? Some guidance? Perhaps you decide to turn around and look at the being behind you, eye to eye, face to face. Or perhaps you simply rest in their arms, allowing yourself to be held, to be whole, to be free. Perhaps you're enveloped by both of these great beings. If there's any piece of this karmic chunk still there, perhaps there's something you'd like to say to it, or a question you have for it. Couple more of those deep, full breaths, and notice the difference in your physical body, your emotional body, your energy system. Is there a change in your mental clarity, your intuitive knowing? Just allowing your consciousness to rest, beginning to find true home. then ease. So we'll close on this note. And I welcome anybody who has any questions and would like to stay for a little bit. I always welcome hearing from you by email about your experiences, and if there's any questions that come up that you'd rather address in that way. I love talking about yoga, and every time it's just the tip of the iceberg. So I'm sure that there'll be a part 3 at some point in time. But I think the next talk like this we're going to do, Shuddha will be doing something on Kali and the Mahavidyas, the 10 aspects of the Great Mother. That will be, actually we're not going to do that till June. So I can't remember if there's something coming up in the meantime. We're always doing various things, as you know. We've got classes coming up and retreats and things like that. But we're going to continue with this wisdom series. It'll be moving to Wednesdays instead of Thursdays. And it may be that at a certain point we're going to invite Ken Lackritz, Ph.D., who is a great student of alchemical psychology and Jung, which really fits a lot of the yogic studies. So it would be really great to have that kind of compare and contrast. So anyway, these are ongoing programs that it's just so nice to have an opportunity to be able to look at these questions because they're big, and to increase our understanding to whatever extent we can, to whatever degree we can. I want to say just one more thing about bringing the transcendent into every day. Sometimes kind of seems like, well, how do we do that? But there actually is a state of consciousness that is called the waking transcendent. And so it is very, very possible, and I'm sure that many of you have done it and have experienced it and walk around in this way, perhaps without even recognizing it. Samadhi, when we're in deep meditation, is what's called, actually it's called sleeping transcendent, which is interesting. Sleeping transcendent. We're not physically asleep, but there's such an indrawing of all the senses like there is in sleep. But waking transcendent consciousness is a very real state of consciousness. So that's what's happening as our consciousness is washed more and more and more by our yogic practices. So continue your paths. Thank you. All right, my dears. We didn't do an Om. Let's do one Om before we head out. Let's just close with an Om, okay? So bring the palms together in front of the heart. And we'll join our voices. And as we join our voices, have this sense as best you can that each of us is this egoic being driven by karmas, but being fully supported by our true nature, and that each one of us is this support and has this support. And so when we make this sound of Om and our voices join, it's more than symbolic. It's an actual physical representation of the oneness of the home that we all embody. So please inhale. Om. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May peace be in our hearts and in the hearts of all beings. Namaste.